Trigger warning. This episode contains content that may be alarming to some listeners. Please make sure to check the show notes for more detailed descriptions and take care of yourself. On this episode, we speak with Laura, who has 3 birth experiences here in Japan.
So I gave birth in a tatami room.
She walks us through some of the issues that she had during her pregnancies.
I started having preterm labor contractions.
And also her fast labours.
It probably wasn't until I got out of the car at the clinic when my water broke all over the street that I realised there was no stopping the baby.
Hello and welcome to Birthstories of Japan. Welcome, Laura. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm great. Yes, nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too. So I was wondering if you'd like to give us a little bit of an introduction.
Sure. So my name is Laura and I was born in Australia. I came as a student at university as my second year of university, and I did a year here, and it was just supposed to be a year, and then it's turned into a lot longer, and I've now been in Japan on and off for 19 years. And I met my husband near the end of my first year here, so I was pretty young. I was still 19 when I met him, and he was a couple of years older than me, and he was in his first year of work, so he was 23. So we have 3 boys. The oldest is 13, the second one is 12, and the youngest is 9. And my first son was born at the end of 2009, and all 3 boys were born in Japan.
Beautiful. That's perfect. So let's talk about baby number 1, your eldest. How did you get pregnant? What was your journey to pregnancy for him?
Well, I'd actually been on the pill for many years before we decided to get pregnant, and I was pretty young, and it was sort of more just, okay, well, timing-wise, since I didn't have a job to go back to and wouldn't be getting any maternity leave benefits, I was leaving my job in Australia. That was already decided. We decided that we might want to start a family, and so I saw the doctor in Australia, and I mentioned that I was going to start trying to have a baby, and so they did some blood tests to check, I think it was rubella and measles levels, and then have a booster for that. And I was on another medication that needed to be adjusted if I was going to get pregnant, so we took a month to change over to a different medication for that. And I went off the pill, and then a month after I went off the pill, I got a positive pregnancy test, which was actually about 7 weeks before our wedding day. We'd been engaged for about 18 months at that point, so I was actually 7 or 8 weeks pregnant with my oldest, N, when we got married. I didn't really know much about my cycle because I'd been on the pill, so but we were actively trying. So I think that I just did a pregnancy test around a month or 6 weeks after I stopped taking the pill, and that's how I found out I was pregnant. I definitely had morning sickness symptoms as well, but I already knew at that point that I was pregnant, and then we returned to Japan after that.
And how about telling your husband? What was his reaction?
I think it was a bit of shock and surprise because we were quite young, and obviously we probably hadn't really thought a lot ahead about the financial ramifications of me not working when we were returning to Japan. But he was excited.
Awesome. And how was your pregnancy with your eldest? How did that go?
My pregnancy with my eldest was really fairly uneventful. Around the time that I got pregnant, there'd been this big news story in Japan about a woman that had given birth in an ambulance because no maternity hospital would take her, and all of the maternity hospitals were full. And this was actually right around the time of swine flu, and finding a clinic was kind of a bit of stressful because we didn't know where we were going to live. So that was part of a little bit stressful at the beginning. We got back to Japan when I was about 12 weeks pregnant. So we were looking at hospitals and doing some research about that. That was a little bit stressful, but once we started going to a clinic, it was fine. So I was going to Oshio Women's Clinic in Urayasu. It went pretty well until about 32 weeks or 31 weeks when I started having what I thought were Braxton Hicks contractions, but were actually like preterm labor contractions. And however, because I hadn't been pregnant before and I wasn't really sure, I was seen rather quickly and they put me on a medication and they said I didn't need to do bed rest yet, but that I couldn't lift anything heavy and I needed to stay on the medication until I was about 37 or 38 weeks pregnant to stop the preterm labor. And one of the side effects of the medication was that it made me really shaky, like my hands and stuff. So I struggled a little bit in the last 6 to 8 weeks, like with cooking and stuff, because even holding a knife, like if my hands were shaking from the medication. But I learned sort of to take the medication in the morning, prep everything for dinner, like at 8 a.m. in the morning before the medication would kick in, and then just cook later on. So that was fine. And my husband did all of the shopping, carrying the shopping and stuff home. We didn't have a car at that point, so I wasn't driving anywhere. But yeah, at that time, we lived in Funabashi, which is just outside of Tokyo in Chiba, and we were about 10-minute walk from the station. And I was encouraged still to like go for like leisurely walks, but nothing too strenuous, and just to stay on the medication. I was checked more regularly. I think I had a weekly appointment from 32 weeks onwards, whereas usually you don't move to weekly appointments till about 36 weeks. But that was just to monitor that I was not going into further preterm labor.
Nice. That just segues perfectly into the next part, going into labor. Tell me about your experience there.
Okay, so I stopped taking the medication around 38 weeks. Most of the pregnancy, they kept telling me that he was like huge. He was such a big child, which is fairly typical, I think, of foreign women giving birth in Japan. But I actually I stopped taking the medication and I had a lot of preterm labor contractions type feeling, but nothing progressed. And I was 40 weeks and 6 days, or 40 weeks, 5 days, I think, when I woke up one morning around 5:30 a.m. I thought, okay, I think I'm in labor. And I was like, oh, well, I'll have a shower. I've got time. I thought I had lots of time. It turns out with all three of my kids, I didn't have much time. But I had a shower. I woke up my husband. He rang his parents and they came to pick us up. And we arrived at the clinic around 10 a.m. It took a bit longer to get there because the traffic was bad, being a Saturday. And they like try to get you to fill in some paperwork. And my labor had progressed so far at that point that I couldn't stand up to fill in the paperwork. And so my husband was filling in paperwork and the nurse or the lady at the desk was like, oh, just, like, just wait a little bit. And I got to the point where I was like, I don't think I can wait anymore. And they moved me into a room. And so I gave birth in a tatami room, like on a futon type thing. So I was able to, like, my labor was actually really short, so I didn't really get to make use of the things like being able to use like a yoga ball or things like that. But they had that type of thing available in the room. And as long as you were not at risk of infection, you didn't have to have a drip or a monitor. So you were able to move positions. So if you would prefer to stand, you were able to stand. If you'd prefer to be on all fours, you could be on all fours. It was up to you. Then they said, okay, well, they checked me and then they said, well, actually, you're ready to start pushing. So once I was already 10 centimeters dilated when I got to the clinic. And by 10:15 a.m., I was pushing, and Em was born at 10:50 a.m., so 50 minutes after I got to the clinic. So, yeah, it was a very quick labor. I honestly thought it would take a lot longer. And I'd always been told that first children take forever. But actually, my own mother had two very quick labors with my brother and I. But the birth went well. The doctor did make it for the birth, but maybe just a couple of minutes before he was born, the midwives at this clinic were trained to also help you give birth. They didn't expect necessarily that a doctor would be present. They were supposed to be present, but they were also not like, okay, you need to stop and wait for a doctor. So my clinic did allow birth plans, and I had written a birth plan, and that was why I wanted to have a freestyle labor room. I wanted my husband to be present if he was at the clinic, and I had written down that I didn't want an episiotomy, but after 30 plus minutes of pushing, the doctor was like, well, he'll come really quick if we do an episiotomy. And at that point, I was just like, okay. So baby N was born in December of 2009, and he weighed 3.2 kilos. I can't remember after he was born, but if I was able to hold him straight away, but I do know that they brought him up for me to see him. And then he was taken away for a little bit, and then I was moved to the room where I was going to stay, and they brought him back. So he was back with me within maybe 45 minutes, and I was able to try to breastfeed within an hour of him being born.
Awesome. So how was your recovery?
So I was 24 when I had baby N, and my recovery was pretty good considering that it had been a pretty fast labor, and that I'd had an episiotomy, but I didn't really have any issues after I gave birth. Recovery was pretty quick in terms of mobility. I had some issues with breastfeeding in terms of latching and discomfort, but they kind of resolved themselves after we got into a routine of doing it. The clinic was fairly helpful with that. Maybe not as helpful as I had hoped, but they were very understanding. They still did promote formula a little bit, but I'd listed in my birth plan that he wasn't to have formula, and they respected that. The one thing that they did do before he was like 24 hours old was give the sugar water, which I think is quite common in Japan. Again, they did ask me about it before just doing it. They just said, look, he hasn't had a wet nappy in a certain amount of period. Your milk hasn't come in. We know that you don't want to give formula. Can we give some sugar water to see if he'll have a wet nappy within the next couple of hours? And that's what we did. At night, he roomed with me. Maybe the second night around like 4 a.m., I asked the nurse to take him to the nursery for a couple of hours, and they did. So, and like he was allowed to stay with me if I wanted to, but we were allowed to ask them to take them to the nursery as well if we wanted to. But the rest of the time he was with me. I was in the clinic for 4 nights. I didn't really question the stay. So I stayed the 4 nights.
Awesome. Okay, so baby number 2, what was your journey to pregnancy like for him?
Okay, so when my first baby was about 5 months old, I got pregnant with baby number 2. And it was an unexpected pregnancy. We were not planning to have a second child so soon. We'd always envisioned that we would have 2 children. We went on to have 3 children, but originally the plan was 2 children. And I was close to 3 months pregnant by the time I found out I was pregnant. I was still breastfeeding baby N. I'd never had a period come back between the 2 kids, which meant that I didn't have any idea of what my cycles would be. If I felt run down or I had sore boobs, it's because I was breastfeeding. I didn't really put any of the dots together until I'd been like sick for like 2 weeks. And then a friend of mine was coming through Tokyo, heading home from London, and she'd lived in Japan for a year before, and she was staying with us, and it was her 25th birthday, and she bought some sparkling wine, and we were going to drink sparkling wine. I'd pumped milk for baby N, and she'd been with us a couple of days at this point, and then she said to me, she's like, have you done a pregnancy test? Like, you just seem to be sick a lot. And I was like, no, I can't be pregnant. I'm still breastfeeding baby N. And he's like, still so little. And she's like, I really think you should take a pregnancy test before we drink these 2 bottles of sparkling wine. And so I did. And I had to tell my friend that I was pregnant, but then I also had to tell my husband, who was like, what? And at that point, we went back to the same clinic, Oshio Women's Clinic in Urayasu. I often had to take baby N with me, and we'd been planning a trip to Australia so that baby N could have his first birthday in Australia, and it was technically his second Christmas, but he was 8 days old at his first Christmas. And even though I was pregnant, we decided to proceed with that trip. And I was actually in Australia from 22 weeks pregnant to 31 weeks pregnant. I was actually in Australia, so I was not monitored while I was in Australia. I did get a doctor's note to fly back. The pregnancy was, I guess, not typical in that I didn't know I was pregnant for so long, and then most of the pregnancy I knew I was pregnant happened while I was in Australia. And I was busy with a baby and pregnant, and so it's kind of a little bit of a blur. And we came back to Japan together, the three of us, on January 3rd. And on January 4th evening, I started to get really sick, and I had norovirus, so I was vomiting all of the time. At first, I thought it was related to the pregnancy, and then I realized it was not related to the pregnancy. And I was really sick. And we called the clinic on the 5th. They said, come in to have a drip, to get rehydrated. We'll do an external ultrasound. We'll check the baby, and then you'll need to come back on the 7th for your regular appointment, and then we'll check you then for preterm labor, as we did with your first one, because that's around the time that you would need to start taking medication. And I went, I had the drip, they checked, they said everything was fine. I went home, and the next day on the 6th, I was feeling a little bit better. And my in-laws brought home baby N around maybe 3 or 4 p.m. So I did the bath, I did the dinner routine for him, and I started to feel a lot of pain, and I just thought it was from vomiting so much, and just was more just like my stomach was really sore from all of the vomiting. And then it kind of became more regular, like contractions. And I rang my husband at work. He was still at work. At this point, we were about 7 o'clock. And then I rang my in-laws to come get me. My father-in-law had a beer, so he couldn't drive. My mother-in-law hates driving, but does have a driver's license. So she drove to our place. My father-in-law stayed in the apartment. Baby N had gone to sleep. My mother-in-law drove me to the clinic. We picked up my husband at the train station on the way. And we got to the clinic, and it probably wasn't until I got out of the car at the clinic when my water broke all over the street at 31 weeks, 4 days, that I realized there was no stopping the baby and that I was going to have him soon. And 8 minutes later, he was born. So for my middle one, my husband wasn't in the room. I was put onto like a bed. He was coming out like bum first, so they had to maneuver him to come out head first. And then I guess when they maneuvered him, or he might have even been before, he'd stopped breathing at this point. So he was not born breathing. He was resuscitated at birth. He was intubated, and he was in an ambulance heading towards an NICU within 10 minutes of me having him. I never saw him before they took him away. So it was quite a traumatic birth experience from that point. Also in Japan, ambulances can't take intubated babies or intubated, maybe not even intubated people. I'm not 100% sure, but definitely not intubated children. A doctor must go on the ambulance. And I'd given birth at this point. It was maybe, I'd have to double check. I think it was about 10:50 at night. So the doctor went in the ambulance with my husband to take baby S to they took him to Jutendo University Hospital in Shin-Urayasu, which is about a 10-minute ambulance ride from the clinic that I was in, maybe a little less. And he was admitted there. I was not transported. I had given birth at the clinic. And by the time I arrived at the clinic, there was nothing they could do, obviously, to stop the baby coming. So baby S was born January 6th, 2011 at 31 weeks, 4 days. He wasn't weighed at the clinic because it was a matter of transporting him quickly, but his birth weight was 1,730 grams. And he was 40 centimeters long. So they measured him at Jutendo. He was not measured upon birth at the Oshio Women's Clinic. And he spent 7 weeks in the NICU. They sort of said that at first it was a little bit more touch and go, but within a week of being born, he'd stabilized a little bit. Usually a baby born at that gestation would be born breathing. He wasn't because of the way he was born. Obviously, they didn't have any time to monitor. I think at that gestation, they would usually do a C-section as well, just to get the baby out fast, but they couldn't in my case. And I know in his case that in the Bosch Techo, the active labor lists 0. So they don't believe I was, well, I'm not sure what they really believe, but in the Bosch Techo, they say I was in active labor for 0 minutes, which is confusing for people here because then they assume you've had a C-section, because that would be the only time you'd have 0 minutes of active labor if you've given birth vaginally. But yes, I'm not really sure why they list it like that. But I've also always wondered who cleaned up the street, like where my water broke over. Like, who does that? Whose job is that? I was still recovering from norovirus and having a baby. But I was not allowed to go to the NICU while I was still a patient at the women's clinic. So I signed out against medical advice the next day. But we went back to my in-laws' house and we stayed there during the time that baby S was in the NICU so that I could visit, so that I could use their car for one thing, and so that they could watch baby N, who was 12 months, 2 weeks old when his brother was born. And they watched him. Well, I would go to the NICU in the afternoons. So the NICU experience here, and it might be different if you stay in the same hospital that your baby is in the NICU, but in my case, we had like 2 times 2 hour visiting windows a day. And so I would go each day between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. And then some days, if my husband finished work on time, he would go and get there around 7:30 and spend 30 minutes in that last window before heading home. In most cases, though, he couldn't make that work on a weekday. So I visited baby S every day, and I pumped milk to take to the NICU. He was moved he was taken off intubation at about 5 days or 6 days old and moved to CPAP, which is like oxygen through the nose. And he was 6 or 7 days old the first time I held him.
Wow.
So he also dropped a lot of birth weight, like his weight went down quite a bit after he was born. And then he started to gain weight. And as he started to stabilize, the discussion was that he would be released when he would reach 40 weeks gestation, or if his breathing and temperature stabilized and he passed 2,500 grams, then he would be released. So in his case, he reached 2,500 grams. So we actually took him home at like 38 and a half weeks gestation.
So how about your recovery postpartum for baby S?
So my recovery for postpartum for baby S was a struggle, and like looking back, and 2011 was can we swear on this podcast?
Yeah, go for it.
It was a bit of a shit show. So he came home, and my mum came over from Australia to help me with the 2 kids. Baby S came home. My mum arrived the day before baby S was released from hospital. We moved back to our apartment. So we'd spent, at that point, 8 weeks in Australia, 2 nights in the apartment, 8 weeks living with my in-laws, or 7.5 weeks living with my in-laws. So it was a very difficult time for baby N as well. He was very clingy because I was leaving him each day. And then all of a sudden, I brought home a baby. There was no real warning because he was only 1 and he didn't really get why we now had another baby. And he obviously doesn't remember now life before he had a brother. But it was a difficult transition to having 2 kids under 18 months old. One who at the time was still special needs, given that he needed medical attention. We needed to monitor his weight. But also looking after a 1-year-old while breastfeeding a baby is quite hard. Like, you have to sit down. We got good at being creative. I often breastfed in the ergo, like while walking around the apartment, so that baby N could show me what he wanted to show me. But that took a little while to be able to do. And then my mum left March 10th, and then March 11th, 2011 was the earthquake here, earthquake and tsunami. And at the time, we were living in an apartment on the 7th floor, and I didn't know if we should leave the apartment. There was a lot of announcements. There was a lot of aftershocks. I couldn't leave the apartment because we couldn't use the elevator, and I couldn't carry 2 kids down 7 flights of stairs. And then we moved into like rolling blackouts after the earthquake, and my husband walked home from work. I think he walked 8 hours to get home after the earthquake. And it was really cold still. And after the earthquake, the phones didn't work real well, so it was really hard to contact him until the networks came back up online. And even though baby S was very small, he still didn't have either passport. And we decided about a week after the earthquake that I would go to Shizuoka with the 2 kids. And then if I decided to leave Japan for a short trip back to Australia, I would then go further on to Kansai and then fly out from Kansai. The issue was that you cannot fly with 2 children under 2 by yourself. And in the end, we didn't go, but we did go to the embassy exactly 1 week after the earthquake to get baby S's emergency passport. So his first passport was one of those like emergency 7-month passports, just in case. But we did go to a friend's place in Shizuoka just to get away from the aftershocks for a short period of time.
Yeah. And so how about the effects on you? Obviously, physically, everything's crazy. How about mentally?
Mentally, I really struggled after the birth of baby S with the earthquake. raising 2 kids. We then decided to move. Packing up the apartment was on me, but I definitely had postpartum depression with after baby S, traumatic birth, 2 kids so young, looking after them by myself. My husband was working a lot. So it was a very stressful year. And a lot of 2011, I really do not remember. Like a lot of when baby S was really small, like I look at photos and I can't even remember taking the photo. Like I'm like, oh, I don't really remember that happening.
Wow. Yeah, you are so strong for getting through that. It sounds like just battle after battle after battle.
A lot of, yeah, I think a lot of 2011 was a pretty crappy year for a lot of people. A friend of mine actually gave birth the day of the earthquake to a premature baby as well. And sadly, that friend has now passed away, but she went into preterm labor and then the ambulance couldn't get through the streets of Tokyo to get her to a clinic. And it was just, yeah. So, I mean, I know that 2011 was a really shocking year for a lot of people. But I was glad to be able to support her, given that her baby was also premature and I'd gone through it in a similar gestation to around 30, 31 weeks. Yeah, it was a really difficult birth. I wouldn't say the pregnancy was difficult. Well, I think I only knew I was pregnant for 3 months of the time that I was actually pregnant with him. And the birth obviously was traumatic. But I mean, I didn't have the recovery physically after I had him. Didn't take any longer than it did with baby N. And so that went smoothly, but yeah.
And how did your pregnancy go for your youngest?
So we had decided to have 2 children. So baby J was not really a planned pregnancy. And I actually found out I was pregnant at the pediatrician's office because I had bronchitis and they wanted to do an x-ray, and the doctor said, so, well, when was your last period? And I was like counting back in my head. I had a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old at that point. And I was counting back and I was thinking, oh, yeah, it was about 5.5 weeks ago. And he's like, well, I can't do the x-ray, but here's a pregnancy test. And so I had to go home and tell my husband that not only was I unexpectedly pregnant with a 3rd child that I'd been told I shouldn't have, like in terms of shouldn't because of the premature birth of number 2, but I also had bronchitis. So the pregnancy with him was fine. The struggle was finding a place to give birth because I felt that it would be a little bit too traumatic to go back and have another baby at the place that had the first 2. I found the care after baby N to be great. I found the doctor that delivered baby S to be a bit of an asshole. One comment that he made after I gave birth was if I'd given birth in the car, he definitely would have died. And I felt that there was a lot of blame placed on me, despite the fact that a doctor at that clinic had checked me the day before. And it was just a little bit far away. But I was also sure that if I did have another premature baby, that I wanted them to go to Jutendo, where baby S had been, if they did need to use a NICU, because the care at the NICU and the NICU was top notch. The doctors were great. The nurses were great. They really cared about baby S, but also about me. So we tried a couple of clinics, and I found Yamaguchi Clinic in Funabashi. I think it's called Yamaguchi Clinic. It was a bigger clinic. So they had about 4 doctors on staff, and I saw the incho at the hospital when I went there, so the head of the hospital, and he said that he would be fine to have me give birth there, but that if it looked like I was going to go into premature labor, he would move me to a hospital. And I said I was fine with that. And I said that my request would be that if we do that, I want to be sent to Jutendo in Odai. So he's like, well, that's not usually where we'd send people because this is Funabashi. And I said, well, that's my only request is that I had another baby. He was there. And he's like, okay, well, that's fine. We can make that call. And I was really monitored really well during the pregnancy. I think even from about 18 weeks, I was having to go in every week for a check. They did put me on medication, but it was more preventative than anything from, I think it was probably about 26 weeks. It wasn't the same medication that they had me on for baby N, but similar thing. It's supposed to stop preterm labor. And then I took the medication until 37 weeks, 4 days. I went to the clinic on 37 weeks, 4 days in the morning. I was checked, told to stop taking the medication. And I went to like Lullaport Mall to meet a friend, walk around, and I rode my bike to pick up N and S at 3:30. And then I came home, got them settled. They had showers, bath, had dinner. I put them to bed, and it was about 7:30 p.m. And I thought, oh, I feel a bit weird. And I was like, okay, well, I should really know now, after 2 children, what labor is, especially given that babies come fast. And at 7:30, I messaged a friend. I said, I think I might be in labor. And she's like, go to the hospital now. Do not wait. And again, my father-in-law had already had a beer, so he couldn't drive me. So my mother-in-law had to drive me. And it was raining a little bit. It was about a 20-minute drive. My contractions were about 6 minutes apart. We had to get out, and I had to park the car because she couldn't park it, because it was one of those ones where you like have to go over the bump and reverse park in, and then when you exit, that little thing goes, you kind of have to go over the bump. So I parked the car. I went into the clinic. I messaged my husband. I was like, okay, you need to come straight to the clinic on your way home from work. And they checked me over, and they're like, oh, it's okay, that, you know, it's fine. I was like, okay, but it's 7:30. I thought I was in labor. By 8:30, I was at the clinic. And just after 9:30, he was born. The doctor was not present when he was born. I was like moved to like labor and delivery. I said to the nurse, no, he's coming now. And the nurse is like, no, he's not. Just stop. And I was like, I can't stop. And the nurse caught him as he was born. And my husband, who'd arrived about 10 minutes before he was born, and he was sitting next to me, or like sort of like behind my head. And the nurse has sort of said to him, I thought I told her to wait. And and my husband was like, I can't do anything about that. And that's when baby Jay was born, and he weighed 2,730 grams. He was born at 37 weeks, 4 days. And he has the initials JJ after my dad, who died the week that I found out I was pregnant with him. So going back to, I guess, when I found out I was pregnant with him, and my husband and I were still like, he's like, how could you be pregnant? We weren't planning on having a third child. We haven't long since built a house. We now have a mortgage. And then a week after I found out I was pregnant, I was flying to Australia for my dad's funeral, who died unexpectedly. And I hadn't told my mom that I was pregnant again, and we hadn't told my in-laws. So, but recovery was fine.
And how was your physical recovery, and also the care at Yamaguchi?
The care was pretty good. I stayed for like the four nights, and after you've had other babies, you kind of just like, yeah, I'm not having to look after or cook for 2 other people at the moment, so just let me stay forever, please. I was kind of left to my own devices most of the time because I'd had a healthy pregnancy and healthy baby at that point, and it was a third child, and they were kind of like, well, if you're good, we're good. So similar though, that was one of the things I was like, if I can have him with me, I want him with me, and this clinic did allow that. So they also didn't use sugar water or push formula at all because I said I wasn't interested and I'd breastfed 2 kids already. So they were like, that's fine. Just weigh him after each feed. If he's got wet nappies, just mark. I think we had like a chart. We had to like, okay, he had a wet nappy. Oh, he had a wet nappy. Oh, I fed him. Like, and they would just check that. And if that was fine, everything was fine.
Awesome. I was just wondering, did you find out the gender for any of your babies?
Oh, yeah. I found out for all 3 of them that they were going to be boys. For baby N, I think I was around 22 weeks. For baby S, it was earlier. So maybe 16 or 17 weeks. And with baby J, I found out in Australia because I had a 3D ultrasound at 20 weeks.
Yeah, nice. And by any chance, I know this was a little while ago, do you know how much each birth cost?
I know that with baby N, I think we paid about an extra 70,000 yen on top of what the government gave us. For baby S, I know that even though I stayed 1 night and not the 4 nights, I was charged a full 4-night stay. But because I'd had norovirus, I had to have a private room. They couldn't put me with other pregnant women or other babies, obviously. But I only stayed 1 night, but we did pay the full price. In terms of the NICU stay, I was under the wrong impression that a NICU stay would just be the $300 yen a day, which was what it is in my city to take the kids to the doctor. However, that's not the case. And I think we got a bill for about 20,000 US dollars. And then most of that money could come back through government grant type situation, like if you apply, but we did have to pay it up front to get him out of the hospital. But in the end, we got everything back except the cost of nappies and the cost of sterilizing the bottles which they put the breast milk in to feed him. And with baby J, I know that the government money went to the clinic directly and not to us. And then I think we paid something between like an extra 50 to 80,000 yen.
That's perfect. Oh, you have a better memory than I do for my own 8-month-old. I have no idea.
I think you're still in the like baby brain stage, so I think you're okay.
Oh gosh. Okay. So for the last segment, I've just got a bottle with me and it's got some random questions in it, and I'll just pick out a few and ask you if that's all good.
Sure.
So for any mums currently caring for their prem and or NICU baby in Japan, do you have any advice?
I'm not sure if this would be the best advice to give, but if you are mentally and physically exhausted from trying to pump milk, there is nothing wrong with formula feeding if that's what you decide to do, because I think from a mental health point of view, from my side, that I think I probably wouldn't have had as many mental health issues if I hadn't continued to push on wanting to breastfeed baby S. More so before he came home, just all of the pumping. I was waking up at night to pump, then getting up with baby N, who was still waking up overnight, and I was mentally and physically exhausted. So that might not be the best medical sound advice, but also if that's what you need to do, you shouldn't feel bad about it.
I love that. Yeah. I think that's actually a common one. Like there's so much pressure behind breastfeeding.
Yeah. And 7.5 weeks of pumping is just kind of insane. Like I probably shouldn't have pushed it as hard as I did.
Thank you for that. And I'll just do one more. Do you think you received enough support here during your journeys?
I think during the pregnancies, yes. I think after you have children here, that it's a little harder to get the support that you need. Even if you have family close by, I think motherhood in general can be a little bit lonely. Especially when you have more than one child, I think, as well, or if you have a spouse that works or a partner that works a lot, especially when they're in that age where they can't talk yet. It does feel a little lonely. So, but during the actual pregnancies, apart from the birth of baby S, I did feel supported. I felt that the clinics, I think I had a really, really good experiences there. And I know that that's not always the case for mothers in Japan. But in my case, or in my cases, the actual pregnancies, I do feel that they do go above and beyond here. I mean, Japan has one of the highest rates of babies born alive, and I think what maternal, I can't remember what the phrase is, but like really low maternal death level as well. So, I mean, even though it can be frustrating at times, especially culturally, I guess, they do seem to know what they're doing. And you are in the best possible care in terms of the physical birthing of babies. Mentally, that might not be the case. Mentally, maybe not as supportive. It's very much what the doctor says goes, not always taking into account what the mother wants or what's best for the mother. But in terms of the physical care that I received while pregnant, it was very good.
Awesome. And before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, but it was really fun and interesting to be able to talk about the birth of the 3 boys, even though they are quite old now. So I hope that listening to the birth stories and also the other people that you interview, that it helps other mums prepare, or after they've had, like, to realize that, oh, wow, my experience was not the same as that, but, you know, other people have had this type of experience, or just a great way to share information so that other mums or mums to be can be informed, but also, hear how it has happened for other people.
Yeah, I think it's really important to share our experiences, because even though maybe, well, of course, every birth is unique, every pregnancy is unique, but just to know and hear about other people's stories gives you so much information. So I just want to thank you so much for sharing yours.
You. Yes, it was lovely to meet you as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure it'll definitely help some other mums out there. So thank you so much, Laura. Have a great day.
Yes, you too. Thank you very much. Bye.
So if you'd like to hear more birth stories, please subscribe to this channel. Giving us a like also helps other moms see this video too, so please give us a thumbs up if you can. You can check out the description for more information about bits mentioned in this episode, but if you have any other questions or feedback, please leave a comment below or get in touch. And lastly, if you're a mama that has a story to tell, please send an email to birthstoriesofjapan@gmail.com. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.